This is a short presentation put together by A3P, a partnership between the AQuest Group at RMIT and Melbourne Water. During this presentation, I will be outlining how to conduct a litter survey from the banks of urban waterways. This presentation is to be used as a guide for setting up and conducting two different methods of litter surveys. It includes safety protocols, detailed methods, and sampling procedures. It is designed to be used in conjunction with two different standard operating procedures, or SOPs, one for each sampling method. Before moving to the methods, I'd like to draw your attention to a few key safety concerns. Working around rivers can be dangerous. So in order to remain as safe as possible, it's important that you understand the risks and take appropriate measures to minimise them prior to commencing the surveys. You can refer to the safety section of the SOPs for more details. Please make sure that you have completed and understood the relevant OH&S and risk assessments prior to commencing the bank surveys. You will need to comply with the safety protocols outlined in these documents at all times. You'll need to take equipment with you to complete the surveys. Here are some examples of essential items that you'll need. This list includes key items, but doesn't include all items. You will need to refer to the relevant SOP for a full list of required equipment, including an indication of the number of certain items that you will need, such as buckets. When deciding where to conduct your bank survey, it's important that you choose sites that are safe to access and easily accessible. Here are some examples of easily accessible banks. You'll notice that the access points, for instance paths and roads, are visible in each photo. It's important that you don't have a long walk to get to the bank that you need to survey. Not only will you need to carry equipment, but you may find that you need to carry the litter away from the site for processing. Furthermore, it's important that should there be an accident, emergency services can easily find you. It's best to avoid sampling steep banks as they can be very hazardous. In this presentation, I will outline two different methods which are used to survey litter. The comprehensive method is very detailed and categorises litter according to its proximity to the water. The rapid method is a little bit simpler and requires less time to be conducted. I will begin by outlining the comprehensive method before moving to outline the rapid method. Once you've identified the bank you're going to sample, work in a downstream to upstream direction to establish your sampling reach. This stretch will extend 60 metres and will need to follow the edge of the water as closely as possible. You'll need to mark the following points along your 60-metre reach. Each point will be 14 metres apart, so if your tape measure isn't 60 metres, you can simply measure 14 metres between each mark. It's important that you mark each of these points, because these will form your transects. A transect will run from each of these points inland at an angle of 90 degrees to the river. Because the river might bend, the transects won't be parallel to each other. That's okay. What's important is that they run at an angle 90 degrees to the river. Now that you've marked where your transect will start, you can start to mark out transect 1. Transect 1 will start 2 metres into your 60-metre sampling stretch. This is where you will have marked your first point. It will start at the water's edge and extend 2 metres beyond the end of the dominant debris line. Your sampling area will extend 2 metres either side of where this transect lies, so will be 4 metres wide in total. So what's the dominant debris line, I hear you ask? Excellent question. The dominant debris line is where most debris, such as litter and organic matter, has been deposited on the bank of a river by high flows. Some dominant debris lines might be easier or more obvious to identify than others. Here's a very clear example of a dominant debris line circled in orange. The organic matter and litter have formed a very obvious line. You'll notice though that this line doesn't extend the entire length along the bank. That's because a dominant debris line isn't an actual line. It's usually formed by a series of clumps of organic matter and litter that are strewn along the bank of a river, so really the line part is down to your imagination. Depending on the amount of debris in the system, the dominant debris line will be more or less obvious. Some will be quite large, for instance this one, which is quite thick and obvious and easy to see. Because you'll be sampling a rather large stretch of the river, the dominant debris line itself might vary along this reach, so you will need to identify it for each transect. What's important is that each transect extends 2 metres beyond the end of the dominant debris line. Let's look at this as a schematic. Here you can see the dominant debris line in orange in relation to the river. The transect extends 2 metres from the edge of the dominant debris line. It's important that you leave the tape measure in situ because the tape measure will form your transect. Using the tape measure, record where along your transect the dominant debris line is present. Also record the length of the transect on your datasheet. Now that you've marked your transect, it's time to identify your zones. Based on how much contact the bank has with the river, you can divide your transect into 3 regions and mark them. Zone A is the immediate flood area along the river. It has the most contact with the water and it starts at the water's edge. It's marked in yellow. Zone B is the intermediate flood area. It ends where the dominant debris line starts. It's marked in light green. Zone C is the high flood area. It's rarely in contact with the water and it starts at the dominant debris line and ends 2 metres beyond where it finishes, which is where the transect finishes. Record the length of each of these zones on your datasheet. Here's a worked example of the zones using the previous example with the dominant debris line. You'll notice that Zone A is fairly small. That's because it's the area that comes into contact the most with the water. The zones won't all be the same size. In fact, the size of each zone will differ along the 60-metre stretch of the river that you're sampling. That's why it's important to record the length or the size of each zone for each transect. Zone C in this example is quite a bit larger than zones B and A. It extends only 2 metres beyond where the dominant debris line ends. Now that you've marked your transect and your zones, it's time to mark the collection area. The collection area extends 2 metres either side of the tape measure. It's marked in grey in the schematic. This schematic outlines how your transect falls across the 3 different sampling zones in relation to the dominant debris line. You'll be collecting litter from each of these 3 zones. There's a specific method we'd like you to use when collecting the litter. Let's start in Zone A. Walk up along one side of the transect, collecting litter as you go. Then walk back along the other side of the transect, collecting even more litter. Repeat this process, walking in the opposite direction on each side of the transect. Once you've completed this pattern, Scan the area to make sure that you haven't overlooked any litter. Make sure you're satisfied that you haven't left any litter behind. Collect all litter within this zone in one bucket. You can repeat this method for zones B and C, walking up along one side of the transect, then back along the other, and then repeating this process so that you walk in both directions along either side of the transect, collecting all of the litter from each transect in one bucket. You should have one bucket of litter for each zone, so 3 buckets of litter for each transect. Congratulations! You've just completed sampling transect 1. Now you can move on to transect 2. Repeat this method for each transect, measuring each one out, including the zones, and collecting litter from each zone in a bucket. It's important to note all of the different measurements for each transect, as each transect will be different because rivers are variable. Here's a brief summary of the method. Transects lie at a 90-degree angle to the river. The sampling area extends 2 metres beyond the end of the dominant debris line and 2 metres to the left and 2 metres to the right of the transect. There are 3 different sampling zones based on proximity to the river. The collection method involves walking up along one side of the transect and down along the other, and then back up in the direction you just come from, and then back down the other, so that you walk in both directions along both sides of the transect. This method needs to be repeated for each zone, so that you have 1 bucket of litter for each zone, so 3 buckets of litter for each transect. Let's move on to looking at the rapid method. You'll notice some similarities between the rapid method and the comprehensive method. Again, you'll be working in a downstream to upstream direction. You'll be marking out a 60-metre stretch following the bank as closely as possible. This time though, you'll only need to mark 3 points along this 60-metre stretch. One at 2 metres, one at 30 metres and one at 58 metres. Transects 1 to 3 will be measured from these points and again will run at a 90-degree angle to the river. Each transect will start at the water's edge and will finish 2 metres beyond the end of the dominant debris line. The sampling area will extend 2 metres to the left and 2 metres to the right of the tape measure. You'll need to record the length of the transect. Here's a schematic of the collection technique. You'll notice that it's very similar to the comprehensive method. One key difference, however, is that you will only collect 1 bucket of litter for each transect. Repeat this for each transect, so that you've collected 3 buckets of litter for the entire method. Let's look at a summary. This time you only have 3 transects and no zones. Let's look at a comparison. Depending on the amount of time and the resources you have available, you might select to use one method over the other. There are a few important things to note about the methodology. Always walk upright when collecting litter. Only bend down when you've spotted a piece and you need to pick it up. Never put your hands where you can't see them. This is because there could be hazards such as sharp objects or dangerous animals hidden in long grass or dense shrubbery. If you stand on something that you think could be litter, use your foot to remove any vegetation obscuring your view, and then identify it before picking it up. Use tongs or thick gloves when picking up sharp or hazardous objects, and if you don't feel safe handling an object, don't. Instead, you can photograph it, mark its location using a stake, and report it to your colleagues. It's important that you communicate any hazards to anyone who you're working with. Only collect litter from areas you can access safely. Don't take risks. Avoid sampling hazardous areas of your 60-metre stretch. Examples of hazards include, but are definitely not limited to, brambles with thorns, snags and large obstacles such as fallen trees or logs, deep or slippery mud where you could slip and hurt yourself. These hazards are commonly found around waterways. Once you've put your transect down and marked it out, if you find that more than 50% of your sampling area is unsafe, you should move the transect a minimal distance. Here's a schematic of how that would look. Transect 1 does contain a hazard, but the hazard takes up less than 50% of the sampling area. You can still collect litter from this transect within this sampling area, but do not collect litter within the hazardous area, just avoid it. You can take a photograph of it instead. Transect 2 also contains a hazard, but this hazard takes up more than 50% of the sampling area. You shouldn't sample this transect at all. Instead, you should move the transect a minimal distance. This could be up or downstream, depending on the location of the hazard. In this instance, the hazard is predominantly located downstream of the transect, so the transect should be moved a minimal distance upstream. The hazard now takes up less than 50% of the sampling area. Litter can be collected within the sampling area, but again, the hazardous area should be avoided. Transect 3 should still be located at the same distance from the original Transect 2, so the location of Transect 3 should not change at all. Now that you've finished safely collecting your litter, what do you do with it all? The litter you've collected is very informative. You'll need to identify the different types of litter you've collected and count how many pieces of each litter type you have. You'll need to weigh the pieces according to groups and record their weight. You'll also need to photograph the litter you've collected. And that's how you process litter. If you're not able to process it immediately after you've collected it, ensure it's sufficiently labelled. Litter quantity and unfavourable weather conditions may prevent on-site processing. You may be able to process litter as you collect it, but this isn't always possible. Once you've finished processing all of your litter, you can throw it out responsibly. The information you're collecting is very important. There are 3 different data sheets attached to each SOP. These include the Waterway Characterisation Sheet, the Litter Characterisation Site Sheet, and the Litter Characterisation Form. You only need to complete the Waterway Characterisation Sheet once per site. You will, however, need to complete both litter sheets once per collection. That's so that we can look at how what you're collecting changes over time. Also attached to the SOP is a description of all the different types of litter that you can collect. That's referred to as a litter characterisation sheet. Now that you've diligently recorded, counted, weighed, and photographed all of your litter, it's time to part ways. You may have collected sharp or hazardous items. These need to be disposed of appropriately and safely. Throughout the course of collecting litter, you may have noticed a pollution event. If you deem this to be particularly hazardous, concerning, or notable, report it to the EPA. In the case of an emergency, contact 000. The site details you'll have recorded in your waterway characterisation form can be used to describe your location. Notify the relevant contact as per the required OH&S paperwork. Additional and detailed information regarding both methods outlined in this presentation can be found in each of the two SOPs, one for the comprehensive method and one for the rapid method. Should you require additional information, please don't hesitate to contact us. Happy and safe surveying. Enjoy!